In the 18th century, the treatment and conditions endured by enslaved people were distinctly harsh. And that harsh treatment, that really violent control of their bodies, of their labor, was intended in part to help create the institution of slavery, to draw a clear distinction between enslaved people and other unfree people, that is, indentured servants or poor free people who might also be laboring for a master or employer. So the types of harsh treatment visited upon enslaved people in the 18th century included physical correction, that is, whipping and physical punishment. People were often branded by their owners, that is, their flesh was marked, right, to indicate that they were the property of somebody else. We also know that other kinds of physical correction were used. People's ears were cut or cropped as a form of punishment for misbehavior. People sometimes had digits, toes, and fingers cut off, also as punishment. People who attempted to escape, for example, might be punished with the loss of toes or even the loss of a foot. So there was a real focus on bodily harm and bodily violence. We also know that for enslaved women from the 18th century through the period of slavery in the American states, sexual violence was used as a tool of coercion, a tool of threat, and as a form of violence. That is, women were raped. Young girls often were threatened with rape and other forms of sexual violence as a means of terrorizing them into behaving in ways and laboring in ways that their owners desired. Enslaved people likewise had little control over their family relations. One of the central features and most haunting features of the experience of enslaved people was the fact that families could be separated by sale or by bequest, right? A slaveholder might decree in his or her will that children would be sent to one owner while parents might be sold to another owner.
The nature of slave families in the New World largely depended on the slave trade from Africa. In the Carolinas and the Caribbean, most slaves who arrived in the New World were single people. They didn't come with their family members, and there was a much higher percentage of male slaves than female slaves. But in the Chesapeake, the gender ratio was even, and slave families proliferated in nuclear units in ways that simply wasn't the case in the Carolinas and the Caribbean. This doesn't mean that slavery was better in the Chesapeake. In many ways, these nuclear units allowed planters to exploit them more psychologically because they could separate slave families and coerce slaves to work or do things that they wanted under the threat of being separated from their husband or their wife or their child.
By the mid to late 18th century, towards the end of the colonial period, most enslaved people lived in their own quarters or their own cabins with other enslaved people. And there, they had the opportunity to form community relations. Those cabins were rudimentary, right? They were not living in comfortable homes. People ate together at set times. Enslaved people's days were regimented, not by their own desires or their own needs, but by the demands of their owners. In most regions, the production of most crops relied on a full day of labor. That is, enslaved workers worked from sunup to sundown. For enslaved women, the laboring day continued into the night. It was during the nighttime that enslaved women would take care of their families, take care of their children, tending to the sick and elderly in their communities. Enslaved women were very resourceful at getting scraps of cloth, for example, especially women who worked in plantations that produced textiles, might sew extra clothing or might try to create a blanket, for example, for their children or for elderly people in their communities. So women in particular did what we might think of as a second shift of labor through the night to take care of their own families.